Thomas Rivera limped through the imperial palace corridors, trying very hard to look like everything was fine, despite the fact that he was bleeding through hastily wrapped bandages and sporting bruises that were darkening across his face in ways that definitely looked worse than they felt. The minor altercation at the public forum had been unpleasant. Xenophobic protesters had decided that physical intimidation was appropriate response to Thomas advocating for human Velcorum trade expansion, and he'd ended up on the receiving end of what was essentially a beating that lasted until station security intervened. Could have been worse. Nobody had weapons, just fists and the kind of righteous anger that made people forget they were attacking someone whose evolutionary history made him significantly harder to damage than they expected. Thomas wasn't particularly worried about the injuries. Humans healed fast, he'd survived worse, and making a diplomatic incident out of protesters exercising their right to disapprove of policy seemed counterproductive to his entire mission of bridge building between species still adjusting to humanity's existence. His plan was simple: get to his quarters, properly treat the wounds, and file a report that downplayed the severity enough that Earth's diplomatic corps wouldn't overreact. The empress didn't need to know that her liaison got roughed up by her own citizens. That would just create complications nobody needed. That plan survived exactly 3 more corridors before Empress Shivara till Velcorum appeared in his path and went absolutely still. Velcorum were predators, apex hunters whose species had conquered their planet's food chain before developing civilization. Shivara embodied that predatory heritage, and right now she'd achieved the particular stillness that predators managed right before they struck. Her eyes tracked across Thomas's visible injuries with precision that catalogued every bruise, every cut, every place where blood was seeping through inadequate bandages. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made Velcorum language sound like barely controlled violence. "Who inflicted this upon you, Earthling?" Thomas tried for diplomatic deflection. "Your Majesty, it's nothing serious, just a minor disagreement at the trade forum. These things happen during tense negotiations." "Names," Shivara interrupted, and something in her tone made her guards immediately move to flanking positions. "Give me the names of those who attacked you." "With respect, Your Majesty, that's not necessary. The situation is resolved, security handled it, and making this into an imperial incident would only." "They shall face retribution," Shivara declared, and Thomas's blood ran cold because he'd read enough about Velcorum culture to know exactly what that meant. Velcorum practiced proportional vengeance as sacred law. Harm inflicted required equivalent consequence to maintain social balance, and Shivara was looking at injuries that would hospitalize Velcorum citizens for weeks, possibly permanently damage their more fragile physiology, maybe even kill them depending on severity. She was approximately 3 seconds away from ordering executions for what Thomas genuinely considered occupational hazards of diplomacy. "Your Majesty," Thomas said quickly, "I need to explain something about human physiology before you make any declarations about retribution." Thomas pulled up medical data on his tablet with hands that were definitely shaking, not from pain, but from the realization that his attempt to downplay his injuries was about to result in people dying. "Humans heal from these injuries in days," he said, displaying comparative healing rates. "Maybe a week for the worst of it. What looks catastrophic by Velcorum standards is genuinely minor by human metrics, because Earth's gravity is higher than yours, and our evolutionary history involved a lot of violence that's selected for resilience." He showed her bone density comparisons. Human bones were significantly denser than Velcorum equivalents. Pain tolerance studies. Humans registered damage that would incapacitate Velcorum as uncomfortable but manageable. Recovery capacity. Human tissue regeneration was fast enough that injuries requiring weeks of Velcorum hospitalization resolved in days with basic human medical care. Shivara listened to this explanation. her predatory stillness shifting into something that looked like she was processing information that contradicted every instinct she had about injury severity. "You're telling me," she said slowly, her voice dropping to tones that made her guards look nervous, "that these injuries which would hospitalize my people for weeks will heal for you in days, and you considered this acceptable enough to hide from me." "I wasn't hiding it," Thomas protested. "I was just not bothering you with minor incidents. Diplomats get roughed up sometimes during tense negotiations. Making it into an imperial incident would destabilize the progress we've made with integration." "Minor incidents," Shivara repeated, and her tone suggested Thomas had just said something that made her significantly more angry rather than less. "You consider being attacked by my citizens to be minor incidents not worth reporting. When the damage is this superficial, yes," Thomas said. "By human standards, this is barely worth medical attention. I've had worse injuries from recreational sports. This isn't worth executing people over." "I'm not angry because the injuries are severe by my standards," Shivara interrupted, and something in her voice made Thomas stop talking. "I'm enraged because my court just watched someone under my protection get attacked, and I'm realizing that your human tendency to downplay harm has been hiding systematic hostility that my administration failed to address." Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, processing what she'd actually said. "You've been absorbing attacks," Shivara continued, her voice getting colder as the implications apparently crystallized. "Dismissing violence as acceptable because your biology lets you survive it. And in doing so, you've taught my people that humans are legitimate targets for brutality that would be unconscionable if directed at Velcorum citizens." "That's not," Thomas started, then stopped because he couldn't actually finish that denial honestly. "Show me your incident reports," Shivara demanded. "Every minor altercation you've dismissed as not worth mentioning." Thomas really didn't want to do that, but refusing a direct order from the empress seemed like a worse idea than complying. He pulled up his personal logs, the ones he'd kept for his own reference but hadn't filed officially, because they seemed like the kind of thing that would create diplomatic incidents he was trying to avoid. 3 disagreements at trade negotiations, where Velcorum diplomats had gotten physical when they disagreed with his positions. 2 instances of harassment at cultural events, where protesters had shoved him hard enough to cause bruising. 1 previous beating at a public forum that had been less severe than today's, but still resulted in injuries. He treated himself rather than reporting. Watching Shivara's expression as she read through the log was like watching a predator calculate exactly how much violence was proportional response to the pattern she was seeing. "You've been systematically abused," she said flatly, "for months, and you've been hiding it because humans heal fast and you thought accepting violence was preferable to making diplomatic incidents." "I thought I was being pragmatic," Thomas said, "proving that humans could coexist peacefully even with hostile factions. Taking hits without fighting back seemed like good bridge building." "You were being a martyr," Shivara corrected, "who inadvertently signaled that humans are acceptable targets because you can take it. And I failed to notice because you're very good at pretending damage doesn't matter when it absolutely does matter regardless of how quickly you heal from it." The argument that followed was probably the most diplomatically inadvisable conversation Thomas had ever had with a head of state, but Shivara seemed determined to establish several points regardless of his objections. First, that proportional justice applied to all protected beings in Velcorum space, regardless of their species' healing capacity. Second, that Thomas's biological resilience didn't diminish the criminal severity of assault. Third, that she was going to enforce these principles with public trials and significant consequences, whether Thomas liked it or not. "You're going to create martyrs," Thomas argued. "Severe punishment for first-time offenders will inflame anti-human sentiment. The violence will get worse, not better." "The violence is already systematic," Shivara countered. You've documented months of escalating attacks that you dismissed as acceptable costs of integration. If I don't establish that humans have equal protection under law, your resilience will continue enabling abuse because my people will believe they can brutalize you without consequence. I'm trying to prevent escalation. You're trying to protect everyone else at your own expense, Shivara said, and something in her voice suggested she was done listening to his objections. And I'm refusing to allow that because sometimes protecting someone means not letting them be the sacrifice that makes everyone else comfortable. Thomas tried several more arguments about diplomatic pragmatism and avoiding inflammatory responses, but Shivara had apparently decided this was the hill she was willing to die on, or more accurately, the hill where she was willing to make examples of people to establish principles about equal protection. Public trials, she said finally, and it wasn't a proposal but a declaration. Significant punishments that establish legal precedent. Official policy making it clear that human healing capacity doesn't make attacks acceptable or less criminal. And you are going to stop dismissing systematic abuse as minor incidents, because your stoicism is enabling violence rather than preventing it. This is going to create problems, Thomas warned. Good, Shivara said. The problems were already there. I'm just making them visible instead of letting them hide behind your tendency to pretend damage doesn't matter. The trials happened 3 weeks later, public proceedings where Velcorum citizens learned several uncomfortable truths about their treatment of humanity's liaison, and about proportional justice, applying equally regardless of species differences. The protesters who'd attacked Thomas were convicted of assault, not the attempted murder charges that equivalent injuries to Velcorum citizens would have warranted, but serious criminal charges nonetheless. Their sentences included rehabilitation programs, community service, and public acknowledgement of harm caused, not execution. Shivara had apparently decided that Thomas was right about martyrdom being counterproductive, even if she wasn't going to let him minimize the crimes entirely. But the trials established something more important than individual consequences. They created legal precedent that humans had full protection under Velcorum law, that biological resilience didn't diminish criminal severity, and that the Empire would enforce these principles regardless of how minor humans claimed their injuries were. The effect was complicated. Anti-human factions were angry about what they saw as disproportionate response to minor altercations. Pro-integration groups celebrated that the Empire was actually protecting off-world representatives. And Thomas had to accept that he couldn't shield everyone from consequences forever, that allowing systematic abuse to continue unchallenged had been harming integration rather than helping it. 6 months later, Thomas filed his report to Earth's diplomatic corps. The Empress noticed my injuries from protest violence I dismissed as minor. She demanded names and declared retribution despite my attempts to minimize severity. Her investigation revealed systematic abuse I'd been absorbing rather than reporting, using human resilience as justification for accepting violence that would be unconscionable if directed at Velcorum citizens. She established legal precedent through public trials that created equal protection regardless of healing capacity. Recommend updating protocols. Sometimes protecting humans means refusing to let us pretend damage doesn't matter just because we heal from it. Our stoicism can enable abuse rather than preventing escalation if we're not careful about when we minimize harm. Shivara's log entry was more direct. Human resilience made systematic abuse invisible to my administration. Thomas's tendency to downplay harm hid hostility I failed to address. Establishing equal protection required overriding his minimization with determination to maximize consequences, because biological differences shouldn't determine legal protections. His attempt to protect my people from themselves by absorbing violence was undermining integration rather than facilitating it. Sometimes the most effective protection is refusing to accept someone's willingness to be hurt for diplomatic expediency. Thomas continued his liaison work, but he started reporting incidents instead of dismissing them, recognizing that human tendency to downplay harm had been creating problems rather than solving them. And Shivara's reforms established that humans had the same legal protections as any Velcorum citizen, not because the injuries were equivalent by biological standards, but because the principle of equal protection transcended physiological differences. The confrontation had been uncomfortable. The consequences had been controversial, but the foundation it created for integration worked not by pretending differences didn't matter, but by establishing that all protected beings deserved justice regardless of how well they tolerated abuse. Sometimes protection meant noticing injuries someone was hiding. Sometimes it meant declaring retribution despite their objections. And sometimes it meant refusing to accept their minimization, because biological resilience shouldn't determine whether violence was acceptable. The empress had noticed his injuries, demanded accountability, and refused to let human stoicism enable systematic abuse. And Thomas had learned that being a good diplomat sometimes meant accepting protection, even when it made him uncomfortable, because letting himself be the sacrifice that made everyone else comfortable wasn't actually bridge building. It was just martyrdom in diplomatic clothing. The bridges worked better when they were built on foundations of equal protection rather than unequal tolerance for violence. Even if establishing those foundations required an empress to override her liaison's objections with determination to ensure that humans couldn't be abused just because